Yay. Hooray. I don't have any theme music today, sorry. If people want, they can post their social handles in the chat. That is always nice to follow each other. So please do that. As for our upcoming events, the big one, submissions are open for our annual awards. Yay! The crowd goes wild. You can go to reportersnotebook.org, and that is where we have info about that. It's also on the Guild's social channels and in the email that I will send this weekend, and in an email that's already in your inbox if you are a member. So lots of ways to figure out how to submit your work. Also, if you are interested in judging and did not receive an email from me, find me and we will get you set up as a judge. I can always use more judges. Many hands make light work. Yay. Today's guest, Mandy Naglich. Am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it, actually.
Wonderful. Mandy has every certification you could have in a liquid beverage, as you can see. And she is also a journalist. We have had her on previous Guild happy hours to talk about how awesome she is at social media, on Instagram and on TikTok. There are her handles. She hosts tasting classes and workshops, and she is the author of this book you see here in my hands, How to Taste, A Guide to Discovering Flavor and Savoring Life. And it is a wonderful, breezy read that is like so fun to just have on your nightstand and read when you want to learn about tasting. I would like to start by asking Mandy why tasting is important.
Oh, good
Full
question.
stop. Not just for beer, not like for professional beer people, but just like tasting things in general. Why, who cares? Why is it important?
Yeah, I think that's like kind of the question that inspired me to write the book, given the title. But I think it just makes your whole life a lot more full to think about what you're tasting and smelling. I think the way that we create memories, the way that we, have experiences, if you're just experiencing the things you're hearing, seeing, feeling, just adding taste and smell to it generally, I think is really makes your life more full and more joyful. And if there's an easy way to do that, why wouldn't we try,
Yeah. When did you know that like tasting was going to be important to you and like as a person and I guess in your career? Because there are so many ways you can come at beverage. You can write about it, you can make it, you can sell it. How did you know that like the sensory aspect of tasting was going to be kind of your like bread and butter, I guess?
I think there was like two different kind of realizations. One was with home brewing. I got like really obsessed with cloning beers. Like that used to be a really big thing, like cloning professional beers. So really tasting everything that I made back and forth, doing a ton of blind tasting other people to see if they could tell the difference. And then that led me to win a gold at the National Homebrew Competition in 2016, which then led to like my Vine Pair column, getting Cicerone, all of those things kind of tumbleweeding. And then on that path, to go for Master Cicerone, you kind of have to take this class called Aroxa, which is getting a certified taster in beer. And it just like completely changed my life. You start this 5-day class. I knew off flavors and like all the compounds you're supposed to know kind of just from studying for advanced, but you really leave the class like razor sharp nose. I could identify these 30 flavors. I was noticing I could like smell my hotel room more. I just felt like everything really, it was like a really eye-opening experience for me to train my senses in a way you would train a muscle at the gym. And I had never considered doing that before that class. And that's when I started teaching blind tasting classes, getting cheese certifications, doing WSET. I just wanted to taste more things. I have so many. I just like love to take a knowledge class and then at the end pass a test to know that I learned everything I needed to learn. So I don't need to list all of them.
A first daughter in your family this
Yes. I keep being like, where's the A or where's my grade for book launch? Like why haven't I seen this yet? So.
I can send you a certificate if you would like for participating today. Two questions there. is smelling your hotel room a thing that you want to do? Like that, is that a good experience?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the hotel room, probably not a great idea, but I mentioned it at the end of the book, but like I was driving through the forest in Portland actually. And I noticed how different they smell from the forest that we go up to Vermont a lot in the summers. And I was just like, oh wow, it's like totally, I think Vermont, now that I think about it, it smells a little sour, like birchy. And I was just driving through and I was like, wow, this scent is just really like placing me here. I'm going to remember driving through this Portland forest. And I think if I wasn't so in touch with these things, it's just like a memory I wouldn't have and something I wouldn't notice. And so maybe hotel rooms, depends on how nice your hotel is, I guess. But yeah, maybe hotel rooms, not so much, but other things, walking into friends' houses have like very specific scents. I've heard I have like a little bit of a potting soil smell in my apartment because I have so many plants. So I don't smell it, but
yeah. Wow. That's really cool. Yeah, that's so cool. The other follow-up, you mentioned that when you were homebrewing, you were really obsessed with clones, which I feel like is a very specific type of homebrewer. Like, I think there are also a lot of homebrewers who want to like not clone and just do like crazy stuff on their own, and they always want to like make a brand new thing that they came up with. What do you think it was about cloning that was like really interesting to you?
I think it's like kind of goes back to that grading thing. Like I've always really liked baking too, where you follow a recipe and if you do it completely perfect, it looks like the picture in the cookbook and everything is, that's what you were going for. And so I think having kind of a goal and making sure I could learn fermentation and learn brewing techniques and achieve something that a professional was doing was much more appealing to me than being like, I mean, I still make these sometimes, like throw a bunch of ginger in a saison and see what happens kind of thing.
When did the tasting go to like a professional level for you? When did you want to achieve these certifications and sort of do this as a career?
I definitely think like Araxa was what kind of made me pivot from like, I want to be like a beer. I really thought my mission was like, I'm going to elevate beer and I'm going to like be this beer educator and tell everyone. And then I kind of just got obsessed with this one aspect of like flavor and beer and like people understanding that more. And then that led me to care more about flavors and fermentation. And I really think that, that class totally like Bill Simpson's in the book for like a whole chapter because he like totally changed my life. So that was definitely flavor and beer and alcohol and stuff, but have spread out a little bit more.
Yeah. Aside from, I mean, I think anyone who's on this call or watching this later, like is aware of Cicerone, is probably aware that you could also become a certified cider professional. There are wine certifications. Aside from like those structured programs, what are just like the everyday things we could be doing that would make us better tasters and smellers?
I mean, definitely the first one is just like focusing before you take a bite or a sip of anything and just, smelling what's going on in your glass or on your plate. But I think a really fun one that I talk about a little bit in the book too is when you go out, if you're, getting drinks, even if you're not drinking alcohol, it could be tea, coffee, whatever, ordering drinks for each other and just trying to decide what you think is in the glass, especially with cocktail culture now where there's like 10 ingredients in every cocktail. It's pretty fun to, get 3. I still get like 3 out of 5 right or something like that. There's always things hiding in flavor. I just had a friend ordered me, it was like a smoked rosemary maple latte. And I knew it was like rosemary maple, or I knew it was rosemary and smoke, but I didn't get the maple. And then you're like, oh yeah, now I do kind of get that. So just kind of, stretching your brain. The thing that makes you a better taster, smeller is all of those connections happening in your brain. So just kind of putting a little pressure on them, trying to create some new connections, connecting memories to what's in your glass right then is going to make you, it's amazing the studies, like it will actually change the physical, like your physical brain very quickly. Within 6 weeks, they can see it on MRIs if you're studying studying smell.
Wow. I guess that makes sense that there are, parts of your regions of your brain responsible for these different, not just for smell, but then memory and vocabulary is something else you talk about in the book. How did you find that most people who are great at the sensory tasting part are also good with vocabulary and and sort of describing those to others, or are there people who can like identify faults but like not communicate flavor? I'm curious if those two always go together.
No, I definitely think there's a really wide spectrum. Some of the I think some of the most amazing tasters that I met were coffee Q graders. They can get like very specific and they're very calibrated to each other in a way I just don't see in other industries. But they use like one lexicon. Like they're never going to get creative and be like, a wild blueberry on the Portland shore at dawn. They're always going to say blueberry, period. Like they're not going to do kind of the flowery language you get in things like sake or wine. And then there's people who are really make these beautiful descriptors, but I don't know that they're always super accurate. They are kind of taking maybe feeling into the process and not just focusing on like the compounds and things that are like definitely there. So huge spectrum.
We love a tasting vibe when we're drinking. But that's really interesting. I've been to informal wine tastings, right? You go to a winery and they pour you 5 things and there's a couple other people with you and they're like, okay, like what do people taste? And they're like, no wrong answers. Are there wrong answers? Like, are there people who are going to say things and it's just like, that's like not, no. So are there wrong answers?
I mean, there's definitely technically like wrong. Like if someone says something like, oh, I smell diacetyl and it's not there, like that's wrong, right? You can't put anything in the glass. One of the master somms I talked to, I thought it was so, he had taken the tasting, I think 3 times and was going to his 4th. And he was like, I realized I start to get an idea and then I just start putting compounds in the glass. And I'm like, oh, if this was a Bordeaux, it might have a little barnyard and all of a sudden you're smelling that. And he said, you really have to work backward from what's in the glass instead of mentally, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get this hint of barnyard. It must be a Bordeaux. We're doing well. But as far as how you interpret things, I was just actually reading something really interesting today about how people think different perfume compounds either smell like grass or don't. And it just kind of has to deal with like where you grew up. And when you were like running around in the grass, what that grass smelled like to you. Like some people will think buckwheat smells kind of grassy and other people don't get grass at all on that. So much of it is like your personal experience. You know, you can't say, no, that buckwheat doesn't smell like grass if it does to you, but you can say there's, no like ethyl butyrate in something. If it's not there, you can say it doesn't smell like mango. So again, a spectrum.
Yeah. Well, so did you, I feel like there's like the starting level of beer sensory where like you're developing your palate and vocabulary and you're learning to put names to words. Do you feel like then it's that level up is the like connecting the chemical compounds and really identifying their presence or absence and then connecting those to word? Is that the 202? Or is there something in the middle?
Yeah, it depends what you want to do. I found it very fun to really get familiar with these compounds because since fermentation is responsible for everything from like coffee to cheese to chocolate to wine, you can kind of start smelling the same flavors across many different mediums and that's connected to the compound. There's also just the fun facts of like Parmesan cheese and stinky feet are the same compound. And when you know that, it kind of makes you think about flavor differently. But I don't think people necessarily need to know that. I saw a good argument in the New Yorker doing research from like Assam who wanted everyone to speak in chemical compounds and leave no kind of gray area of like, what is lush pepper and things like that. He wanted everyone to say like pyrazines and things like that. But I just don't think that's sexy enough for anyone to actually care about your tasting notes if it's all compounds.
That would be terrible.
Yeah, exactly. And so intimidating, right? You would just feel like, I want to leave. So
yes, this is like 10th grade chemistry. No, thank you. So I would imagine it's true, but can you speak to the ways that, working in beverages that aren't just beer or not even beverages, cheese, chocolate, how those have probably enhanced your beer tasting vocabulary?
Yeah, I think something I talked about when we were talking about exercises you can do and something I talk about in the book is I think it's really interesting to try 2 things that are very similar. So like 2 different green teas, because that's where you start to notice differences, and you can say, oh, this green tea does smell more like wheat or like more like vanilla or something. Whereas when you're just smelling green tea, those are kind of notes you wouldn't necessarily pick up. You'd say it's like grassy, earthy, things like that. And chocolate's been really interesting too. I think it taught me a lot about aftertaste, like the length of finishes. We think some beers have longer aftertaste, but I think the difference in chocolate can be like 60 seconds can be like a decent aftertaste, whereas beer, pretty much after 60 seconds, we're for the most part done with the aftertaste. So I think, yeah, just like kind of learning just different aspects and the way you kind of think about different aspects of flavor can come back to beer.
This book is obviously not beer specific. Did it ever occur to you to write a beer specific book? Was that going to be too narrow? What prompted you to just be like, this is tasting literally everything?
It definitely occurred to me. I was like, I kind of want to do like a romantic coffee table-ish book because I loved like traveling to different beer-centric countries. And I was like, there's my excuse to, you know, go to Japan and like do all these things. But I think also when you come like from an industry, I'm sure you guys run into this too. It was like really hard for me to like, I kind of started to not notice what is interesting about beer anymore because I was like too in it. So like what was interesting to me, like consumers, it was like way beyond the consumer, and what a consumer finds intriguing, I would be like, oh, everyone knows that. So I think finding this like kind of new science that was still new to me, but I was knowledgeable in one aspect of it, was the perfect thing where I felt like I could report and discover, but also I have a really solid basis in like my knowledge and education of that aspect.
That's so interesting. How do you sort of keep a pulse on that consumer part? Because I would imagine with your level of expertise, it's like very easy to like start living in the geek world and you're like, that's what's interesting over here. But how do you sort of keep grounding in like, you know, what normal people are thinking?
I do think teaching classes is really helpful for that. It's nice to kind of start like what I think is like the most base level and see, you know, are people leaning forward and nodding, or are they kind of bored and leaning backward? And you can kind of gauge with what you introduce, what level your audience is at. And definitely just like doing all of these book events, it's been really interesting to see what certain audiences start responding to, and then I can just kind of go down that path. But yeah, I've definitely found start extremely basic, because even things like, what country is Guinness from? Like if you're at a really basic level, especially not like a beer venue to do an event, people don't always know. So
what I don't know, in some of these book events already, like has it surprised you at all, like what people are responding to or what they're getting out of the book? What are you hearing from people who have read it?
Yeah, it's really fun because some of the events have like moderators who have read the book and are asking me questions, and like people find the part about how chewing affects how you taste like naturally really interesting. That comes up all the time. I had to go back and reread that part. I was like, wow, I did not think I was going to get so many questions on these 4 chewing styles. So little like studies like that popping up. Everyone really loves like the color ideas and things like that. And I thought like the travel chapter was going to be what everyone was like, oh, this is so great. And it hasn't come up as much. So just goes to show.
Well, I had a travel question. I was curious, a piece of advice that I received early in my like beer tasting and judging career was to eat as many foods as I could from across the world, because there are ingredients that we don't have, and you know, like mangoes taste different in different places and whatever. I'm curious what types of lessons you've learned or skills you've developed from, I mean, you live in New York, you could eat anything on earth, from eating and drinking broadly, how that's sort of changed your work.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you said, living in New York, when I travel now, I try not to stay in big cities. So like we went through the Netherlands and only did a day in Amsterdam and really did like all the countryside and stuff like that. I think really realizing how we season our food so intensely in our country. Also, expands into like beverage as well. I think being able to appreciate subtleties is something that the rest of the world does so well. And we really don't, like, even like, yeah, in the like countryside in France, people having two different wines that I felt like were very, very, very similar. People at the table are like, oh my gosh, this one so different. You can like tell the cold weather. And I'm like, wow. So I think realizing the way other people had their palates tuned to those subtleties, and me feeling like the food was a little bit bland other places. I got advice on going to Japan at the end of next month, and that I should start toning down my seasoning for a couple weeks before, so I can really enjoy when I do like more of the kaiseki style food and stuff like that, which I really want to. So
what is that style of food? I'm not familiar.
It's kind of like a progression of like really small, like I think like jewel boxes is what I hear a lot. But like I've had kaiseki dinners here, but they start like with very like vegetable focus and then moves more fish and protein focus. But they just don't necessarily season things the way that we do, because they appreciate the ingredients so much. The vegetable itself, they don't need to put a ton of salt on it like we do.
We are the land of flavor blasted.
Yes, exactly. There's a good actually part in the book, now that I'm thinking of that. I don't know if you've gotten to the part about yokon, where the Japanese tourism board was trying to bring a new dessert to America, and Vogue wrote about it. And they end up writing, there's all these people who've been making yokons for centuries, and they're beautiful, they're perfect, they're very subtle flavors. And then the American chefs put it on a lollipop stick and roll it in crunchy rice to serve it. And it's like completely the antithetical of what this is supposed to be. And I just thought that was like a perfect, and that was like the Vogue write up. They're like, but if you really like crunchy, you can go to this chef's table and get it on a lollipop. And I was like, yeah.
The best sushi, because I've never visited Japan, the best sushi I've ever had in my life was in the US. But I'm like sitting at the sushi counter and I'm watching the sushi chef like season the rice differently for different fish. And I was like different levels of rice vinegar, different types of rice vinegar. And I was like, wow. And we put like cream cheese in it.
Or when people just dunk it in the soy sauce, like no matter what fish it is. And
that's such a great lesson. How has tasting in this way improved your life personally? Like, obviously professionally, this is what you do, but I'm curious, sort of the, like, I guess, personal and emotional impact that this work has had on your life.
I mean, I definitely think it has made, like I said, like my connection to a sense of place a lot deeper. I think taking in my surroundings more, remembering people I'm with when I'm eating and having conversations about what we're eating. I think the idea of like terroir, I've always kind of thought was like very woo-woo, whatever. But the more you learn about even like the farmers who have like milk that makes cheese, like people can tell in tasting situations, like farms that are a couple miles apart, like the differences in flavor. And I think really grounding yourself through flavor and like knowing where you are, the less we can, import produce from super far away. Like maybe that just means you're having less citrus because there's not citrus where I live. But I think it's just really interesting to kind of ground yourself and use it as a way to like connect with your environment. So I think that's definitely something that changed. I never really thought of like the issues of that, right? Like kind of just like as a human person living in an environment, like I don't know that we maybe should be having these terroirs from all over the world every day in our diet. So that's not in the book at all. That's just something that I've noticed and I'm very curious about.
I wanted to ask a question that I thought would be useful for the audience assembled here, and for me personally. Maybe this is actually just a question for me. Hopefully it matters to other people. So when I was still at Draft Magazine, we did a ton of straight up just like tasting note beer reviews in the back of the book, and they were super duper fun to do. Like all of us editors would sit down at, I think it was 3 p.m. every day, and we would each bring like a couple bottles that came in that day that we were excited about. and we'd sit around and taste them, and someone was the secretary and whatever, someone turned them into beer reviews. Do you find value in those if people's palates are very personal? Like, is there joy for you? Is there like joy in reading like tasting notes for a beer you're not drinking? Like, I'm just curious how you see that type of editorial coverage. You can answer that like personally or professionally, I guess.
I'm like, okay. Yeah, I've always thought those were, it's never something I've done. So I'll just say maybe there's a reason for that. But I think those are really useful, I think, for people who are learning. And if you can taste a beer and see if you are comparing to the tasting notes and you taste what's there, I think that's helpful. But I always like, for almost all of those kind of like, when we write a lot of those pairing articles and stuff too, and I'm like, does anyone actually like use these? I don't know. I think maybe it's a nice vehicle to introduce someone to a new label and see a new brand, but I don't know that I've ever used them in that way. I don't know if other people do. I remember like the days of like when everyone used to stand in the grocery store and like look up Beer Advocate and like read everything. But I don't know if that you're looking for like a tasting note. I don't know. It's more like you were talking about like a tasting vibe. I feel like, is it like light? Is it heavy? Like that kind of stuff is helpful. I'm sure also at your table, that's so fun, 3 p.m. every day. I'm jealous, but I'm sure you guys kind of swayed each other too without even noticing, right? It's like someone says, oh, grapefruit. And then everyone's like, oh yeah, great. Like,
I'm sure. Yeah, it's, those were, I mean, not to like rehash how we used to do things in a magazine that doesn't exist anymore, but those, those notes would sometimes like inform different articles we were writing, but then the scored reviews in the back of the book were a blind tasting panel that like, people were doing individual score sheets and then discussing. So there was like a little bit more methodology for that, because I agree that like you start to have a little bit of groupthink when you're all kind of together. And like, it's so fun when you notice other people's like quirks and tasting preferences too, or like vocabulary. It's just like, oh my God, like stop saying lemongrass. Like it's not lemongrass, whatever people's individual like ticks are. And I think, I guess the blind and like individual judging kind of tries to compensate for that a little bit.
I'm curious when you were giving it a score, like what was the grading toward? What was the, like, what's a 5 stars? How much, is it just that it's a good beer, or was it style?
We were using BJCP score sheets. So like,
that's something that's so crazy about the beer industry. I didn't realize is so crazy. Like other industries don't do that. They don't grade that way.
How
like,
do they, tell me more.
It's just like, no one's like I'm so used to the same thing, right? I've judged a ton of homebrew. Like, it's like, you're like, oh, is this a brown ale? Okay. It's a 5, it's a 4 out of 5 to being a brown ale. But like when you're judging a Merlot, no one's like, this is 4 out of 5 to being a Merlot. They're just like, is this good? Is this well made? It's a very different, like I like talked to a sake judge who he was like just fascinating, a lot for reporting. And they know like the flaws, but no one's like, is this living up to this other commercial example of sake? Or is this like the idea of this sake in my head? Is they're not scoring it in that way.
Sure.
And I was just, it was something that it's so ingrained to me, if you're scoring a Golden Strong and it doesn't taste like Duvel, it's not going to be a 5 out of 5. And I don't know why we do that. And I don't know if a consumer knows that Duvel is the best Golden Strong.
I have seen judges like not come to blows, but like get so heated about that with each other at tables where it's like, this is like a fantastic, like this saison is like so delicious, and I'm like, it should have like a little more phenolic character, like technically. And it's like, okay, but like I could drink 17,000 glasses of this, it's so delicious. Like, I guess it doesn't have like moderate to high phenolics or whatever,
right,
like
exactly
low phenolics, and now you want me to dock it, and it's just like, what are we? That is like a wild discussion. And I guess I didn't know that other industries don't do it that way.
Just the way our score sheets are structured.
Hi. No, I thought that was a really interesting thing that you mentioned, Mandy, about how in the wine industry or other industries, like it's not the same type of guidelines for judging. And I see that to be a huge advantage, but I wonder if that's also kind of like less accessible for people, like because there's not it's more subjective, maybe. You know what I mean? Like there's guidelines. So if somebody is new and wants to become a judge, you can refer to these guidelines and that's what you're looking for. But if you don't have like as a refined palate or like an experienced palate, yeah, I mean, maybe you can just speak to that a little bit. I don't know if you have any opinions.
Yeah, no, totally. I totally, I totally agree. And I think it's interesting then when you become like a wine critic, you're coming up through, territory that's basically just built on your own palate and other people you've been drinking around. So it's like, it kind of becomes like more of a group think, like we were talking about earlier. I don't know that it's necessarily better. I do think it allows those industries to be a little more nimble. Like there's not like these uprisings of like, oh, they're using a new grape as much that I've seen as there is like with hazy IPA and like, it doesn't match the guidelines. What is it? Like, I think obviously natural wine created a huge stir, so I can't say that, but it's just a totally different way of thinking about judging. And it's more moving toward flawlessness than it is matching any kind of template. And I just, to me, parts of that seem a little more in service of the consumer. Is there anything that's bad? Does it taste bad? Do we not like it? To Kate's point, like if it's a saison you can drink all day, every day, like isn't that what a consumer is looking for? Do they care about the phenols? But maybe judging isn't in service of the consumer. I'm not here to be the arbiter of judging.
Yeah, no.
But it just was a really interesting thing in reporting. I was like really surprised.
I find it interesting too. And I think, it goes both ways for sure.
On the topic of you have some remarks about this in the book, Mandy, but expertise can sometimes breed snobbishness. How do you, I would consider you extremely not snobby in your beer communication or your beverage communication, but how do you guard against that?
I think it's interesting because there's actually a study who I got to talk to the scientists pretty extensively about the more expert you get once you're past being a novice and you're kind of proclaimed as an expert, the deeper you go, you actually become less and less snobby. And he has a really interesting way that the more expert you get, the more you can put things into groups. And I only got to talk to him probably like a third of the way through reporting. And I wish it was at the very beginning, because then I started like every master somm, every sake expert, I'd be like, what's your favorite under $10? And they would immediately have an answer, like no question. First of all, Franzia Rosé is the best boxed wine. Every single wine expert said that like off the bat. And then Evan Williams white label, bottle and bond, $16 bottle of bourbon, all of the whiskey experts. And I was like, wow, it's amazing that it's like, kind of like how people will be like, oh, I love Modelo or something. They have their lager. So I think the more expert you get, you actually have these other categories where you're like, can very quickly, even coffee, they're like, oh, this is my favorite instant espresso. If you have to do instant espresso, they realize there's times when you just need instant espresso. You don't need to be a snob about it and say, I'm not going to drink coffee. So I've never actually found that to be a problem. Maybe also my budget keeps me humble. So yeah.
I'm gonna buy more Franzia Rosé on that recommendation.
Especially very, very cold. That's the move.
Yeah, necessary. I have like questions about the book writing process, but I would like to open this up to other folks who might have questions. I don't want to.
I have a million questions.
Yeah.
I have a million questions. This is exactly. Thank you,
Don,
Mandy.
take
this
it over.
Is exactly my nerd
Don,
thing.
co-host.
No, so I actually I had a question that I wanted to ask before this session started, and then as you were talking, I thought of another question. But the question I wanted to ask is we all know that food and beverage tastes different at different temperatures. Cold beer tastes different than warm beer. A lot of that is the volatiles. But I was wondering if as well, in our saliva, we have enzymes. We all know that enzymes, you're a home brewer, different enzymes are activated at different temperature. Is there a temperature effect on the enzymes in your mouth, in your saliva, that affects the flavor at different temperatures?
So I don't know about enzymes. Our receptors are the closer things are to body temperature, the easier it is for them to transmit signals to our brain. So if something's very, very hot or very, very cold, our sensitivity to different things, especially bitterness, sweetness, fluctuates. So that's why like very hot coffee or very cold coffee is pleasantly bitter, and room temperature is like disgusting. That is just like, there's a ton of studies on that. Enzymes, I'm curious that I don't know if they'd have enough time to work quickly enough to.
That's it. I don't know where I read this. It might have been in your book. I've got a few chapters in, but I did recently read about enzymes in your mouth that will work on dextrins in beer and would, in theory, make you taste beer as being sweeter, but for the fact that you don't hold beer in your mouth for like 60 seconds, so it doesn't even have time. So it just doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
Yeah,
it's theoretically possible, but yeah.
I also, your pH would be changing at the same time as the enzymes are trying to act, and I think you would. Maybe if you could try probably holding it in your mouth. Now I'm curious if you were holding something in your mouth for a while, what would happen?
So I do think that's another thing. I do think I taste different things when I, quickly eat it or slurp it versus sip it. I do think that there is some effect there. So
definitely.
Yeah. Okay. My second question is, I do think that there's such a thing as palate shift. Is that purely an educational thing, or can that be a physiological thing as well? And the reason I ask is because I have a number of friends who have gone dry, who used to be my beer tasting friends. And we used to have a fairly common, like we would agree on a lot of things. And now they taste completely different than I do. Is it because they have different experiences, or is it a physiological?
So the well-documented physiological palate shift is with bitterness, and that just has to do with basically bitterness is what we take as poison. So if you're a baby, a little bit of poison will kill you. So it tastes terrible and you want to physically spit it out. As you age, if you can get past that original experience as a youngster, you'll be less and less sensitive to bitterness because it's less and less likely to kill you. Your body's a little stronger. You can survive. So that's one that I think people are like, oh, you don't like beer because you're getting used to the bitterness. You're also kind of aging into accepting bitterness. Maybe why Negronis are popular with the older people. But as far as your taste experiences with, like, if you totally stopped eating something, say you stopped eating vanilla, that would be a really strong flavor to you the next time you had it, if you went 6 months without it. And that's, again, same reason. It's like a difference. Our palates, our noses are difference detectors. It's basically our senses are trying to keep us safe. So if you have something that's scary new, it's going to really jump out to you and say you're eating something different. If you basically telling your brain, if I feel sick after this, I'm not going to eat this again. So you kind of lose your vanilla is comfortable and safe. And then when it's new again, it's like, oh, is this going to be bad? And as you get used to it again, it's not. So maybe there's certain compounds in alcohol you're not thinking of, maybe it is like certain malt compounds that they're just not eating bread as much either or something. So now they're those parts of their palate and receptors are a little less sensitive. But that's totally conjecture. I can't say exactly why they are changing, but that kind of sensitivity to what's common is well documented. And that's why, like, I opened the book talking about the cup tasters competition and this guy who ate just like rice and chicken for months and months and months. And the reason wasn't to, make him a better like taster necessarily. He just wanted to be super, super sensitive to any new compounds. And that kind of competition is smelling 2 cups and picking the different one. And it worked for him. So he definitely was sensitive to anything that wasn't rice and chicken, and won still, like, his record is unbeaten. So
What kind of rice? What variety of rice and what variety of chicken? I'm just kidding.
Great question.
Okay, I'm done geeking. Thank you.
No, that was great.
No, anyone should keep going. My follow-up to the question about like maturing into bitterness, is that why like sweetness is usually like derided like as a juvenile preference. Like it feels like in wine and in beer, it's like people who are more advanced or more sophisticated are like, things are too sweet. Even like cake and stuff, it's like, oh, you like the Costco sheet cakes? Like, no, like have this like much more subtle whatever. Is that why sweetness is like looked down on?
I think so. Yeah. And I mean, same reason with like sourness being something that's like, oh, I like sour beer. Cause again, sourness is like a poison trigger for us. But yeah, I think it's just like, yeah, people think it's babyish, juvenile. Everyone likes sugar. So it's like, you're not interesting if you're, not reaching for the tangy lemon. I mean, I had a lemon wedding cake, so look at me, but you're not reaching for something complex. It's very one note kind of thing. But yeah.
I don't think I've ever read this anywhere, but I have this personal theory about why IPAs became so popular in the United States, which is essentially like what we're talking about is our cuisine just doesn't have a lot of bitterness in it. So when people started tasting these bitter beers, it was very exciting and new to them, kind of like sour ales. Like the first time you have one, it's almost shocking. And somehow IPAs had the lasting appeal, but there aren't that many foods in sort of North American and European cuisine that focus on bitterness. It's just uncommon.
Even our coffee is very bitter.
And I think like to what we were saying, like with you saying like, oh, sweetness is babyish. Like when we had that kind of like race off to like what was the most bitter beer, it was like, no, I like this. Even it's like, do you? You're like, oh, I don't care how bitter it is. Like I'm cool. I like it. And so I think that was the great IPA race when it was like, how many hops can we put into something? IBU records.
That was like bro gatekeeping.
Mm-hmm.
And they were literally called like arrogant bastard or like
yeah, it was like atomic, like weapon something.
Oh yeah, the penguin, tactical nuclear penguin. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Not to take us too far away from tasting, but someone who is not on the call but like submitted this question that I should ask you. So your book says you interviewed like 114 people, which is incredible. They wanted to know how you organize not just interviews, but also just like research, ideas. Like this feels like the kind of book that could be 8,000 pages long if you wanted it to be. So how did you organize yourself practically?
Yeah, it was a lot longer when I first turned it in. So yes, I've definitely used a lot of Google Doc folders. So I did folders around ideas, and then within each folder, it would be scientists, tasters, and then just like as far as interviews. And then I would have a folder that was like all the research papers. I also am very lucky that like the iPhone functionality came out while I was researching that you can search in your screenshots for words and like it will come up like all. So I was like screenshotting everything and like putting like chapter 4, all my audio from interviews and stuff. I would like put the quote text and put chapter 4 and like would search through it on my iPad. So I don't know that I did it well. It was definitely organized around ideas and then file naming well so I could search for things. But yeah, it took a while to figure out which ideas would be which chapters and things like that. So probably not well. But yeah, I used Temi. I stopped trying to transcribe all of my interviews because I just realized that was like, it was a lot. Because some of the people I talked to like 4 or 5 times. And then, yeah, that gets to be hundreds and hundreds of transcripts. So yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer. Organizing around idea and making things super searchable so I could like search for my ideas and they would come up.
I want to know what Temi is.
I guess it's Rev now, actually. It's just like a transcription service that I think it's like a couple cents a minute, and it was worth the investment for me. It doesn't come like perfectly through, but again, those are searchable. So I can go into my Temi account and search like retronasal aroma, and anyone who said retronasal, it will come up in the transcript. And then just labeling those interviews well, so I know who to credit and everything. Yeah, I have like an old.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh no, I just have an old iPhone that I like have all the voice memos on still, like all labeled and like what date everything was. So yeah.
I hope you keep that forever.
I'm too afraid to like get rid of it.
When did you know that this book idea was viable? Like, did you pitch this? Did a publisher come to you? Like, when did you know that this was a book that was gonna like actually exist in the world?
I'm super lucky. I had a totally different experience than a lot of my friends who pitched books. I wrote the proposal and I picked like my 10 agents that I was like, these are like the dream, but I had like 60 that I was like, then I'll send it to the next 10 and the next 10 and the next 10 and hope. And I got responses from like 7 of them right off the bat, and we sold it pretty quickly, went to auction. So yeah, just like from my like pitch emails, I got pretty quick responses, which is not normal from what I've heard. I also think COVID was, if there's any silver lining, I guess, like getting in someone's email inbox about like tasting and smelling when everyone's like, all of a sudden there's more funding behind research, everyone's worried about it. I think people were excited about it at that time. So I also went from teaching like a ton of blind tasting classes for income and then couldn't do that anymore. So I just was like, I have this knowledge, like, let me try to kind of turn it into a book proposal. So
yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
With a few minutes left, I want to again open the floor if anyone else has questions for Mandy. Jump in.
I don't know. It's not really a question, but more of a comment. I have been doing beer stuff for a long time, also in advanced Cicerone and teach and stuff. And I just want to say, like, this book is amazing, and the world needed it badly. And I just want to say congrats.
Thank you. That's so nice. It's like it's like harrowing to see it come out, and like who's excited about it, obviously still working to get more people excited about it and get it out there. As much as like I feel like I've built a platform compared to other authors and stuff, it's a very tiny platform. So that's kind of the next hill, but every time someone says something like that, I get really excited. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre how, you know, how hard it had been to find some of this basic information. And, you know, people really, I mean, like you say in the book, it just enriches your life if you can develop these skills even a little bit. You know. And yeah, I just think it's something I promote also, so I love it.
Yeah, and I mean, we like work with all the brewers and everything, and all the artisans who like work so hard to make what the different things, and it's like we have 2 senses like basically dedicated to appreciating all of those artisans' work, and we just don't use them necessarily.
This is like a country where people like eat food while they're walking down the street, right?
Yeah,
like for like if you can get someone to be in the moment and really experience these things, it's just strangely unfamiliar because you do spend a lot of time eating and drinking. So
yeah, I know. And that's like COVID, I feel like did kind of give people their appreciation of like, oh, I'm afraid now to lose my sense of smell. Like, which, yeah, yeah, me too. I mean, that was like very scary, but even like the average, not taster, not using it for their job, got that like little scare about that.
Yeah. Another thing that really spoke to me, having just read the first few chapters, was, sort of moving on from beer. I mean, it's really hard to maintain passion for any one thing for so long. So I don't know. I just, that spoke to me too,
I also just got so burned by the Master Cicerone experience that I feel like I was like, I'm going to pivot and do something like, so yeah. But that also built all the foundation of like what I needed to report this. So I'm so happy I did it. But yeah, that was like, I was like, I'm ready to look elsewhere. I know a lot of people are gearing up to take it again in the beginning of October. So I feel for them from afar.
I'm in a study group with a few people who are going to take it probably in a year not this year, but we're all doing the Aroxa course together in a few months.
Oh, that's gonna be so fun. I'm jealous.
Yeah,
Expensive,
first time.
so worth it. Yeah, Shelly Smith, I'm doing a book event in Boston with her at Sam Adams. She's taking it again. So like
there's some people who do it like year after year after year.
I don't know how.
So it must be amazing.
It must be so much fun.
A thrill, yeah.
Mandy, can I ask,
Yeah.
you have certifications, various certifications in wine and beer and cheese and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a favorite culinary item? I'm not asking for like a singular beer, but like, is beer your passion? Is sake your passion? Is cheese your passion? Like, what is the most interesting and fun category for you?
I mean, I think the more I learn about it and like my taste and, studying cider was like, I was like, I'm a cider girl now. And now I'm like loving sake. I think it's just fermentation generally. And I think what I was saying about once you're really in tune with your flavors, you can kind of taste, our yeast working across everything, which I think is so cool. And the more I learn about fermentation, like I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but makgeolli is my new, like I've been really into when I can track it down. And that fermentation is just a little different than like yeast-based fermentation. And so for now, that's my answer. I'm sure, like I said, I kind of go in these 5-year cycles of things. So I was definitely, my 5 years of beer, I guess, is up. We'll see 5 years of taste and keep going. But I don't think I'm not partial. And that's what I wanted the book to be, really impartial to whatever you're passionate about. I think it's relevant to you.
Makgeolli. So that's something I need to learn more about. Makgeolli.
Yeah. Okay. I love, we have 2 brands that are made in New York, but you can get it imported.
Okay.
Good liquor stores.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, I love that as a place to at least stop our recording.